Hello, my name is Jerry Armstrong. I'm from Toledo, Ohio originally. I now reside in Northeast Ohio, outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and my roots are from Mississippi.
What year were you born, Jerry?
1955,
When's your birthday?
July 6th. I grew up in a rural area, actually just outside of Toledo in southern Michigan, right across the state line, right outside of Sylvania, Ohio. And then we moved and migrated to the inner city of Toledo. We lived in the projects. I'm the oldest of 7 children. My parents were married at a young age. I'm the first child of 7. They separated when I was in the 6th grade, and I became the elder, so I ended up being the man of the house in the 6th grade. But they never got a divorce, but they stayed in contact and everything. It impacted from the standpoint that we knew we lived in the projects, so we had to watch everything. But the impact, my father was still in our life, okay? He would come over and stuff of that nature. They just couldn't live together in the same house. I went to a number of elementary schools because we moved around a lot in the beginning. But my high school was St. John's High School, just outside of Toledo there. It's a private Jesuit high school. And so I, along with another friend of mine, we were a project. So they wanted to take some inner city kids and put them in a private all-boys school. And so we were part of that project back in the late 60s. Yes, it was a great experience, very impactful, very grateful, very glad that I went through that experience. I graduated in 1973. My parents were born and raised in Mississippi. They were childhood sweethearts. My father ended up migrating to the Toledo area when he was a youngster, a teenager, I believe it was. They had to get up in the middle of the night and move unexpectedly. And so they exit the South, from my understanding. And then my mother, her mother died when she was a teenager as well. And so she moved from one relative to another relative. Eventually she migrated to the north to stay with her sister and got reacquainted with my father at that time.
Why did your father have to leave suddenly in the middle of the night?
It's one of those stories that they don't really tell you other than something happened and they, whoever the they was, but I think it was the KKK at that time, were coming to look for him, and they had to leave. They just got up and left. There were other family members that lived in the Detroit and Toledo area because of the automobile industry. They had migrated and they were working in the plants at that time.
And how about your mom? Why did she move north, you said?
She migrated to north to stay with her sister. My mother ended up leaving the South because of her mother passing away, and she lived with an uncle, she lived with an aunt, and then she eventually moved with an older sister up in Toledo, Ohio. Yes, my mother made it a point that we always would go spend our summers in Mississippi. My mother was one of 19 children, and by the same, one couple had 19 children, so they were sharecroppers back in the day. She made sure that we all stay connected with her family members. So a lot of our siblings still lived in the South. And so we would travel back and forth by way of car, by way of train. It would not be unusual for her to take 2 or 3 of the kids and go to Chicago by way of Toledo, catch a train, and we'd take the train. Or if some of our cousins were leaving Detroit and they would pass through Toledo, she would hitch a ride. And then when I became of age and turned 16, I would drive them down often. At the time, it didn't really make sense, but as I gotten older and learned different things, why we did not necessarily go to certain restaurants or restrooms as we know them today. Our travels were strategic at the time. However, I did not realize that. I remember one time we was traveling and we stopped in Dayton to follow my one uncle. He was heading down with his family. And every time we crossed a state line, he would pull over and say, I got to get air in the tire. And then the one stop, I said, Uncle, why don't you need to get that tire fixed? And here, when I went around the back, he was actually switching out the license plate because he didn't have a valid license plate, a valid driver's license. He avoided being pulled over by changing the license plate on his car to the state that he was in. At that time, typically, the state troopers and that would pull over people traveling from the north. And so when he left Dayton, we crossed the Ohio River into Kentucky. He went and got air behind the one gas station, and then he would change it and put on a Kentucky plate. When we traveled through Kentucky, he crossed over into Tennessee. He pulled over to get some air, and that's when I realized what he was doing. And he had plates for every state we would cross to. So that was his one way of avoiding being pulled over and not having a valid driver's license. His name was Albert Pearson, Uncle Albert Pearson. My mother's name was Ora Pearson. Her married name was Ora Pearson Armstrong. My father did not have a name. He had initials DC. He was one of 16 children. So we have a lot of relatives. I was aware that there was danger because my sister is very fair-skinned. So they would literally, she was probably 3 or 2 years old, they would literally cover her up when we got around. They would put blankets over her and cover her as we traveled in the South because they did not want to be pulled over and someone would think that they had stolen a white baby. And so she tells that story today. She even used to pray to have a spot or something to let people know that she was, of African-American descent. And believe it or not, one day she woke up and she had a brown spot on her forehead. It's a they call it a birthmark now, but she actually prayed for that. We had another number of relatives we would go around and see and visit, but I thought it was fun, but the chore was to go pick cotton. So I manually would pick cotton with my other relatives while from the north, for me, it was just a summer thing, but I didn't realize it was the way they earned their money in the whole bit. And so I would go in the fields and pick cotton with them. But I do remember once when I really realized what segregation was at the age of 4, because I hadn't started school, so I remember how old I was because I hadn't started school yet. I was gonna start kindergarten the next year when we returned home. And I remember going to the movie theater, and my mother was about to go in the door, and the officer says, "I know you're one of those Pearson girls, and you've been up north too long. You know you can't go through this door. And if I'm not gonna do anything this time, but next time you come this way, I'm gonna have to knock you upside your head." And I was a little shocked at that, and I said, "Wow." And so she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot." And we walked around the back, climbed the back of the stairs, and the movie at this time, and I don't watch it even today, it was a black and white King Kong versus Godzilla. I would not watch that movie. It was a black and white movie. I remember it was in black and white. And being up in the rafters, in the hot and sweaty rafters. So that was at 4 years old. So that's when I really saw that part of it at that time. So I had a little flashbacks every now and then. When coming up in Toledo, I lived in the projects, but then in high school, I was around, very wealthy, affluent families and that. So I got the taste of both sides. Down in Mississippi, rural Mississippi, a lot of our relatives had, outdoor plumbing. There was no indoor plumbing. So a lot of outdoor facilities, going to the restroom, no running water. You had to prime a pump, the whole bit. So that was in the 60s. Many of them today are doing very well. Have you? But there were definitely differences. We were taught at an early age, my brother and I, that we had to lay our money on the counter. We could not. She didn't advise us to touch anybody's hand in the South. Put the money on the counter because of Emmett Till. Because one of the things that supposedly came out was that when he exchanged money with the clerk, he did something with her hand and the money. That was one thing, and then he whistled or something. So we were taught not to do that. We had to lay the money on the counter. She says, so it's not offensive, but some people may get offensive by it. I find myself doing that today sometimes. I'll lay the money on the counter even today. It was just drilled into us.
Do you remember if your parents ever used a green book? Was that anything?
I would say no, they did not. My father never really went back to the South. He only went back one time, and he could not read or write. He was illiterate. He eventually learned to read a year before he died. He passed away when he was in his mid-50s, and his one goal in life was to read one book. And he ended up studying for a couple of years before he passed away to read one little book. So that was that. My mother, she had us join AAA though. I've had a AAA card ever since I was 16. So, but I don't recall the Green Book itself. We knew that we had to be past certain cities before sundown. So there were, and again, back then you could do 70, 80 miles an hour, okay, with no problem. So we drove throughout the day. We start out early in the morning, and we would usually in Mississippi by the time before the sun went down. So we never ever, out of all the years, I never ever recall staying in a hotel or anything. We always drove straight through. Let me think about that for a second. Do I like to travel? Oh, yes, I love traveling. Recently, I have a little nephew, a Buckeye graduate, Ohio State, OHIO. He teaches English as a second language in Japan. So in December, we were over in Japan. We went to visit him. Recently returned from the Greek islands. Took a 7-day cruise out of Venice. Did the 14-day Mediterranean cruise. I love traveling. My wife and I, we travel all over the world. As of right now, I think the place that I'm intrigued with would be Italy. Okay, I'm intrigued with Italy because I like the structure of Venice. I like Venice to visit. I would not want to live there, but it's just the structure and how they were able to build a city like that and the waterways. So Venice is the one. So now that I'm a little older, we'll do more traveling here in the United States, even though I've been to a number of great places here within the United States. But we're older now, so, and she's retired. I'm not retired. I'm always cautious, always observant. I'm very aware of my surroundings when I travel. I have this saying, I like to do a little recon, so I do research prior to going to mostly any city. We will look in Google or whatever. We'll get the news report on what's latest political unrest in that particular part of the region. This last one, we were sort of hesitant because of what's going on in the Gaza Strip. So, but we realized that where we were at, we wouldn't be near the conflicts. So we decided to travel anyway. So I do research when we do the travel. But the impact from my early years is to always know where you're going. You map it out. I do not rely on GPS. Even today, traveling within the United States, I usually keep an atlas in my car and pass that on to the grandson and the nieces and nephews. You should have an atlas. Don't depend on the electronic device. Yes, we are very familiar. My father and mother taught us to learn how to read it. My father could read a map. He had a valid driver's license because the employer that he worked for helped him get his driver's license, even though he was illiterate. And he taught him as if he was a foreigner. He says you can get your driver's license as a foreigner without knowing English. And so he taught my father how to maneuver that system and read the highway signs and all that without being able to read English. And so even to this day, I mean, I look at mile markers and know that most even numbers are east to west, most odd numbers are north to south on the interstate. So you at least have an idea of which way you're going. So we try to embed that with our nieces and nephews and our kids. I love being behind the wheel because I shouldn't say this, but most boys like to drive fast. And so they said, we got to get there. So that's all I needed. That was the green light for me. And I typically would get behind a semi truck and I'd tailgate and I would draft. So I really loved driving. My experiences driving was great. We knew at certain cities we would get to just to get the gas or whatever. And they would tell me, I mean, my aunts and my mother, because mostly it was just, I was the only male in the car most of the time, other than my brother who's passed since then. But we were the only males in the car. So typically we were taking our aunts or my mother and then our sisters and, driving. Yeah, but I had no problem driving. To me, it was a treat. So I really did enjoy that. But having said that, my father knew, he taught me at a very early age how to change the tire, oil, gas. He says we had everything in the car that we needed. I just saw one of the articles or one of the exhibits in the next room, and we really were. We were prepared. And speaking of which, we had the picnic basket, everything, all our food. There was no reason to pull over to stop to get food or anything of that nature. We had everything we needed in the car. We had all the things to pump up the tire, change the tires, so I could change the tire in a car without a heartbeat. I could change plugs. He showed me how to do plugs if a plug goes bad. So at 16, I was prepared to do all that. I just think that it's very important for young people to understand that they do need to travel. They need to understand other cultures and, just humanity within itself. And having your family reunions are crucial, and to take photos and pictures and videos and so forth and share those. And you can only do that by traveling and, making space and time for that.